In his new film Flipped, director-co-writer Rob Reiner revisits the 1950s, as he did a generation ago in his delightful movie Stand By Me, also a film about children. But it is another, more recent film that Reiner's latest work made me think of. What does Rob Reiner's Flipped and James Cameron's Avatar have in common? I know the differences between the two films are far more obvious than the similarities. Cameron's megabuck sci-fi film is set on an alien planet and filled with thrilling special effects enhanced action. Whereas Reiner's little film is set in a 1950s suburb where a boy and a girl are engaged in a love-hate relationship. The closest thing to a thrilling adventure is the scene in which the girl refuses to climb down from her favorite tree because workmen have come to cut it down, and the firemen arrive with a huge ladder, and then her father has to climb up to coax her down. So as not to drag this out any further, here's my answer to the question. I'm proposing that the two films share the theme of learning to see others through new eyes. Indeed, the necessity of seeing others in a new way. In Avatar, our hero, Jake, is an ex-Marine paraplegic who is part of a large group of scientists and soldiers sent by a mining corporation to extract a precious mineral from a planet called Pandora. The mother lode lies beneath the ground over which towers a huge tree sacred to the natives. Jake and his fellow humans regard the tribe as just an obstacle which must be overcome. That is, he does until he inhabits an avatar body and lives among them, and comes to appreciate the tribe and see them and their sacred tree through new eyes, that is, through their eyes. Flipped also is about learning to see through new eyes. The eyes this time belonging to 8th grader Bryce Losky, who begins the film by telling us about the day 7 years earlier that his family moved into the neighborhood. Julie Baker, also his age, had come running from across the street and made a nuisance of herself by trying to help them unload the van. Why, she even grabbed his hand, and all he could do was to stand there looking at her. She embarrassed him even more the next day at school by welcoming him with a big hug. Thus, all through their school years, from 2nd grade to the 8th grade, Julie had stalked him, or so Bryce says. One of the pleasures of this movie is that the narration flips back and forth between Bryce and Julie. Her recollection of that first meeting is different. She says that she wanted to become acquainted through helping her neighbors, and that when she looked at Bryce, she was smitten by his eyes, so she took hold of his hand. She was certain that the shy boy was about to give her her first kiss, but then Mrs. Losky came out and introduced herself. And so all through those early grades of school, Julie believed that it was Bryce's extreme shyness that was the reason he avoided her attempts to connect with him. The Losky and the Baker families are very different from each other. Bryce's mother is very cheerful, but his father is usually sour and grumpy. He frequently criticizes the Bakers because their front yard is so run down. The smile here is not typical of him. The Bakers love doing things with and not just for their children. The family sometimes singing at the dinner table when the two older musician sons are home for dinner. They encourage Julie to think for herself, and they enjoy participating in learning projects with her. Mr. Baker, knowing how heartbroken Julie was when her beloved sycamore tree was cut down, presents her with a painting that he has made of it. It is Bryce's grandfather, Chet Duncan, who helps Bryce see through new eyes. He moves in with the Loskys after his beloved wife dies. For a long time, he just sits in a chair and looks out the window. Finally, though, he notices that Julie resembles his wife, and so he goes over to meet her. When Julie learns of a disparaging remark that Bryce had made about their front yard, she uses the money earned from selling eggs to buy supplies and tools for fixing up the yard. Chet shows Julie not only how to clip hedges, but also joins her in building and painting a wooden fence. Bryce resents his grandfather spending so much time with his perceived enemy, pointing out that the two of them had scarcely exchanged 2 words since he had come to live with them at the house. But his grandfather's explanation of how Julie reminds him of his wife is the beginning of the boy's change of heart, and thus his coming to see Julie through new eyes. Another contributing factor to the boy's enlightenment is the newspaper account of Julie's confrontation with the tree cutters. The reporter had made no secret of his admiration for the girl's strong principles and her willingness to stand by them. However, Bryce still has to overcome the influence of others, such as his best friend Garrett, who does not like Julie. This reminds me of the delightful translation by J.B. Phillips of some words of the Apostle Paul to the Christians at Rome. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. Bryce's experience with another girl, the class glamour girl Sherry, also makes him aware of how different Julie is from other girls. When he mentions the subject of perpetual motion, Sherry hasn't a clue as to what it is. Earlier, however, Julie, whose project on the study of egg embryos had won first prize at the school science fair, had shown that she was very familiar with the concept. But just as Bryce is learning to see in a new way, Julie herself is changing her view of him, and it's not in his favor either. Who can blame her, with the boy failing her during the course of the movie in so many ways? So, when after 7 years of living across the street from each other, Mrs. Losky invites the Bakers over for dinner for the very first time, neither grumpy old Mr. Losky nor Julie are especially happy about the affair. There are some convivial moments, and some very tense ones during the course of the meal, but Julie virtually ignores the boy she had once liked so well. Now it is Bryce who cannot take his eye off Julie, even during the school science lab. Like Jake in Avatar, Bryce now sees through new eyes. How Bryce proceeds to convince Julie of this, that he is a changed person, will take a new measure of maturity. The way in which Bryce finally achieves his goal should warm your heart. I doubt that Bryce has read the classic children's novel The Little Prince, though I would bet that Julie has. But I believe that Bryce now would understand the meaning of the best-known quote from that book. Detractors of Flipped, who claim that nothing much happens in it, would do well to read The Little Prince themselves. Indeed, the film has not done well at the box office, but I'm fervently hoping that it will find its audience when it's released on DVD. You owe it to yourself to see this film.